My mother gave my baby an empty box as a gift for her first birthday. Why did my mother pretend my baby didn't exist? When I married Daniel, my mother acted like I'd personally betrayed her because he was a mechanic instead of some lawyer or doctor she could brag about. She literally told me on my wedding day that she gave it 2 years max. But when I got pregnant, I thought things would change because she'd always talked about wanting grandchildren. I was completely wrong. From the moment I told her I was pregnant, she acted like it wasn't happening. She'd change the subject immediately whenever I mentioned the baby. When I showed her ultrasound pictures, she'd glance at them for half a second, then start talking about her book club, or her neighbor's new fence, or literally anything else. She threw a fit when I asked her to come to the baby shower, saying she had planned a spa weekend that same day, even though I'd told her the date 2 months earlier. My mother-in-law threw the shower instead, and my own mother didn't even send a gift. When Jane was born, my mother didn't come to the hospital. She said hospitals were full of germs, and she didn't want to get sick. My father came alone and held Jane for hours while my mother stayed home reorganizing her closet. She didn't meet Jane until she was 3 weeks old, and even then she refused to hold her. "I don't want to drop her," she said, standing 6 feet away like Jane had some disease. But she'd held all my cousins' babies no problem. She'd post constantly on social media about being a proud grandmother to my sister's kids who lived across the country, but not a single photo or mention of Jane, who lived 20 minutes away. When people asked her about her grandchildren, she'd only talk about my sister's twins. If someone specifically asked about my baby, she'd say, "Oh yes, the baby," and immediately change the subject. She'd come to our house and sit in the living room while Jane was right there in her bouncer and act like she was invisible. She'd talk to me and Daniel about everything except the baby that was literally right in front of her. If Jane cried, she'd make this disgusted face and say, "Can't you take her to another room? I'm trying to visit with you." Like Jane was some annoying pet instead of her granddaughter. Family dinners were the worst. She'd set up high chairs for my sister's kids when they visited, but told me to keep Jane in her car seat on the floor because she didn't want food on her furniture. She'd pass around photos of my sister's kids to relatives, but when I tried to show Jane's photos, she'd interrupt and say, "Everyone's already seen them on your social media, they don't need to see them again." She'd buy expensive gifts for my sister's kids and send me links to garage sales for Jane's stuff. The breaking point came at Jane's first birthday. I'd planned this small party, just family and a few close friends. My mother said she'd come, but showed up 2 hours late after all the guests had arrived. She walked in carrying this elaborate gift bag, and I actually thought maybe she'd finally come around. She made this big show of placing it on the gift table, then sat in the corner on her phone the entire party. When it came time to open presents, I saved hers for last, thinking it would be special. Jane was sitting on my lap as I opened this beautifully wrapped box inside the fancy bag. It was empty. Completely empty except for a card that said, "For Jane's college fund," with nothing inside. No check, no cash, no bonds, nothing. Just an empty card in an empty box in a fancy gift bag. Everyone went silent. My mother just stared at me with this smirk and said, "What? I thought you'd appreciate the gesture. Money's been tight since I've been helping your sister with the twins' preschool." My mother-in-law lost it. She stood up in front of everyone and said, "What kind of grandmother gives an empty box to a 1-year-old? What's wrong with you?" My mother tried to act offended, saying, "I don't appreciate being attacked in my daughter's home." That's when my aunt stood up. "You haven't touched that baby once in a year because you hate her father. We've all watched you pretend Jane doesn't exist while you post about your other grandchildren 50 times a day." My mother tried to deny it, but my cousin pulled out her phone and started scrolling through my mother's social media. "Look, here's 20 posts about the twins from last week. Where's Jane? Oh right, not a single mention in an entire year." My father, who never spoke up about anything, finally said, "I'm ashamed of you. You've punished an innocent baby because you don't approve of who her father is. Daniel's been nothing but good to our daughter, and Jane is a blessing you've chosen to ignore." My mother's jaw dropped. She tried to sputter something about being misunderstood, but my father cut her off. "You've had a year to show you care about this child, and you've chosen not to. I'm ashamed." He said it again, louder this time, and the room went completely silent. My mother-in-law moved to my side and put her arm around my shoulders while Jane sat on the floor tearing into wrapping paper, completely unaware that her grandmother had just been exposed in front of everyone. I felt this weird mix of relief and sadness wash over me, because I'd spent 12 months wondering if I was being too sensitive or reading too much into things. But here were all these people who'd watched it happen, confirming that yes, my mother had deliberately pretended my baby didn't exist. My mother looked around the room like she expected someone to defend her, but everyone just stared back. My cousin held up her phone showing post after post about the twins with 0 mentions of Jane. My aunt crossed her arms and shook her head. Even some of the friends who'd come looked uncomfortable, clearly piecing together that they'd just witnessed something bigger than a bad gift. My mother grabbed her purse off the couch and stood up fast enough that her chair scraped against the floor. She headed straight for the door without looking at anyone, her heels clicking hard against the hardwood. I expected my father to follow her like he always did when she stormed off during family arguments, but he didn't move. He stayed sitting in his chair and watched her leave, and when the door slammed shut behind her, he turned to me with this exhausted look on his face. "Can I hold her?" His voice came out shaky and quiet. He reached his hands toward Jane, who was still playing with ribbons and bows, totally oblivious to the drama. I nodded and picked Jane up, placing her in my father's arms. He held her close against his chest, and his eyes got watery as he stroked her hair. "I'm so sorry," he whispered to her even though she couldn't understand. "I should have said something months ago." Daniel stood next to me and squeezed my hand while my father rocked Jane gently back and forth. That evening, after everyone left and we'd cleaned up the party mess, Daniel and I sat on the couch in the quiet house. Jane had fallen asleep in her crib upstairs, worn out from all the excitement and cake. I kept replaying the whole scene in my head, seeing my mother's face when everyone called her out, hearing my father's voice crack when he said he was ashamed. Daniel pulled me close and I rested my head on his shoulder. "I need to tell you something," he said after a few minutes of silence. "I've felt your mom's judgment since the day we met. The way she'd look at my work clothes when I picked you up for dates, how she'd ask what my career plans were like being a mechanic wasn't a real job." His voice stayed steady, but I could hear the hurt underneath. "When you got pregnant, I thought maybe she'd get over it, but then she just acted like Jane wasn't real. Like if she ignored us long enough, we'd disappear, or you'd leave me." I lifted my head to look at him and saw pain in his eyes that I hadn't fully recognized before. "I never wanted you to have to choose between me and your family," he continued. "So I just kept my mouth shut and took it. But watching her give our daughter an empty box today, seeing that smirk on her face, I realized she's been punishing Jane for having me as a father." I grabbed his hand tight because I didn't know what else to do. He'd been dealing with my mother's cruelty this whole time and never complained because he didn't want to make things harder for me. The next morning, my phone rang at 8 o'clock. I saw my mother's name on the screen and my stomach dropped. I answered, and before I could even say hello, she started yelling. "I want an apology for how I was treated yesterday. I was humiliated in front of everyone in your home." Her voice was sharp and angry, like she was the victim in all this. I took a deep breath and kept my voice calm even though my hands were shaking. "I'm not apologizing. Everyone pointed out what you've been doing for a year. You've ignored Jane and treated her like she doesn't exist because you don't approve of Daniel." There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. Then she said, "How dare you speak to me that way? I've done nothing wrong. That gift was perfectly appropriate." I felt anger rise up in my chest. An empty box isn't a gift. It was cruel and everyone saw it. She made this disgusted sound. "You've always been dramatic. I don't have to sit here and listen to this." Then she hung up on me. I stood there holding my phone, staring at the blank screen, realizing that my mother genuinely believed she'd done nothing wrong. 2 days later, my father showed up at our front door alone. He was carrying several wrapped packages and looked tired, like he hadn't been sleeping well. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I opened the door wider and he walked into the living room where Jane was playing with blocks on the floor. He set the packages down on the coffee table and sat on the edge of the couch. "These are Jane's real birthday gifts," he said. "I bought them weeks ago, but your mother wouldn't let me bring them to the party. She said the empty box was the only thing we were giving." I felt my chest tighten. He'd wanted to give Jane actual presents, but my mother had stopped him. "I want to see Jane regularly if that's okay with you," he continued. "Weekly visits, helping out, being an actual grandfather instead of pretending she doesn't exist." His voice got thick with emotion. "Your mother refuses to talk about what happened. She's telling everyone she's the victim and that you're keeping her from her grandchild. But we both know that's not true." I watched Jane stack blocks while my father explained that my mother was acting like the confrontation at the party never happened. She'd deleted all the social media posts about the twins that my cousin had shown everyone and was now posting about family betrayal instead. I told my father he could visit Jane every week, but I needed to be clear about something. My mother isn't welcome here until she actually admits what she's done. Not just says sorry I felt hurt, but genuinely acknowledges that she spent a year rejecting my daughter because she's ashamed of Daniel's job. My father nodded slowly and didn't try to argue or defend her. "I understand," he said, "and I think that's fair even though it hurts to admit it." He looked sad but not surprised, like he'd known this was coming. He got down on the floor with Jane and helped her stack blocks, and she laughed when he made silly faces at her. Watching him interact with her made me realize how much she'd missed out on having a grandfather in her life this past year because my mother had controlled when and how he could see her. After an hour, he stood up to leave and hugged me tight at the door. "I'm sorry I didn't stand up to her sooner," he said. "I kept hoping she'd come around on her own, but I was wrong." I told him it wasn't too late to be part of Jane's life, and he smiled sadly before walking back to his car. Later that afternoon, my mother-in-law called to check on me. "I've been thinking about you since the party," she said. "I wanted you to know that I dealt with something similar when my first child was born. She explained that her own mother-in-law had rejected her son because she didn't approve of the marriage. It took me a long time to accept that some people can't get past their own prejudices, even when it means hurting innocent children. Setting boundaries with her was the hardest thing I ever did, but it was necessary. She offered to meet for coffee if I wanted to talk through the complicated feelings that come with having to protect your child from your own parent. There's this guilt that comes with it, she continued. Like somehow you failed by not being able to make them love your baby. But you didn't fail. She did. Her words hit me hard because that was exactly how I'd been feeling. Like maybe if I'd tried harder or done things differently, my mother would have accepted Jane. But my mother-in-law was right. This wasn't my failure. It was my mother's choice to let her class prejudice matter more than her granddaughter. A week after the party, my sister sent me a text asking if we could meet up and talk privately. I need to tell you something that's been bothering me, her message said. I agreed to meet her for coffee while her twins were at preschool. We sat at a table in the back of the shop and she looked nervous, stirring her coffee without drinking it. I've been really uncomfortable with how differently our mother treats our kids, she started. But I didn't know how to bring it up without causing drama in the family. She admitted that she'd noticed our mother's constant posts about the twins versus complete silence about Jane. I told myself maybe you didn't want her posting about Jane or that you preferred privacy. But watching what happened at the party made me realize I was making excuses for her. Her voice got quieter. I should have said something months ago. I should have called her out when she'd talk about the twins nonstop, but changed the subject whenever you mentioned Jane. Instead, I just stayed quiet because it was easier. I appreciated her honesty even though part of me wished she'd spoken up sooner. My sister leaned forward and her eyes got serious. There's something else you need to know. Our mother has been making comments about Daniel since you two started dating. She's told me multiple times that you married beneath yourself, and that she expected better from you. I felt my face get hot with anger. She's compared Daniel to my husband constantly, talking about how at least I married someone with a respectable career. I'm so sorry I never told you this before. She reached across the table and grabbed my hand. Watching everyone confront her at Jane's party made me realize that by staying silent, I was enabling her cruelty. She's been punishing your daughter for having Daniel as a father, and I just let it happen because I didn't want to rock the boat. Tears started rolling down her cheeks. I'm ashamed of myself for not protecting Jane. She's my niece, and she deserved better from me. I squeezed her hand because I could see how guilty she felt. We talked for another hour about our mother's behavior patterns, and how she'd always been obsessed with appearances and status. My sister promised she'd start calling out our mother's favoritism whenever it happened instead of pretending everything was fine. When I got home, my aunt called. I need to apologize to you, she said right away. I should have confronted your mother's behavior way before that party. I've watched her ignore Jane for an entire year, and I kept telling myself she'd eventually come around. Her voice sounded frustrated with herself. I'd drop hints about how Jane was growing or suggest she post photos of her, thinking maybe gentle nudges would work. But the empty box proved that wasn't enough. She needed to be directly confronted, and I should have done it months ago instead of waiting for things to get that bad. She explained that the whole family had noticed what was happening, but everyone was too afraid of my mother's reactions to say anything. We all failed Jane by staying quiet, she said, and we failed you by making you deal with this alone instead of backing you up from the beginning. I told her I appreciated the apology, and that I understood why people avoid confrontation with my mother since she tends to make everything about how she's being attacked. My aunt agreed but said that wasn't an excuse anymore. That baby deserves grandparents who love her unconditionally, and if your mother can't do that, then the rest of us need to step up and make sure Jane knows she's valued. She promised to visit more often and to keep calling out my mother's behavior whenever she saw it happening. The days after the party felt different. I'd wake up in the morning and realize I wasn't already thinking about my mother's next visit, or what she might say, or how I could make her finally see Jane. That constant weight in my chest had lifted without me even noticing at first. Daniel pointed it out one morning while I was playing on the floor with Jane. He said I seemed more relaxed and that I was laughing more with Jane instead of watching the door like I expected my mother to walk in and ruin everything. He was right. For an entire year, I'd been trying so hard to win my mother's approval that I'd been tense even in my own home. Now that everyone knew the truth, I didn't have to pretend anymore. I could just be Jane's mom without worrying about what my mother thought about every single thing I did. My phone buzzed 3 days later with a group text from my mother to the entire family. She wrote that she was punished for giving a practical gift, and that I was keeping Jane away from her grandparents. I stared at the message, feeling my face get hot. She was actually trying to rewrite what happened and make herself the victim. Before I could even respond, my father sent a message to the whole group saying that wasn't true at all. He wrote that my mother was welcome to see Jane anytime she genuinely wanted to, and that nobody was keeping her away except her own behavior. He said she'd spent a year acting like Jane didn't exist, and that one party confrontation didn't erase 12 months of cruelty. My aunt added a message agreeing with my father, and my cousin sent a thumbs up. My mother didn't respond to the group chat after that, but I could picture her face turning red with anger that my father had called her out in front of everyone. 3 weeks went by with no contact from my mother. Jane was getting bigger every day, and I took tons of photos of her learning to clap and trying new foods. My cousin posted pictures from Jane's birthday party on social media, with a caption about family members who truly show up for the children in their lives. The photos showed Jane covered in cake with my mother-in-law and my father smiling in the background. My mother commented on the post asking why she wasn't tagged. My cousin responded with a screenshot showing my mother's social media page. The screenshot showed 20 posts about my sister's twins from the past month and 0 posts about Jane from her entire first year. My cousin wrote that maybe my mother should ask herself why she never posted about Jane if she wanted to be included in Jane's celebration photos. I saw the comment thread blow up with other family members liking my cousin's response. My mother deleted her comment, but the damage was done because everyone had already seen it. That same night, my phone rang, and it was my aunt calling to tell me that my mother had blocked my cousin on every social media platform. My aunt said my mother had called her screaming about betrayal and family loyalty. My aunt told me she'd stayed calm and explained to my mother that telling the truth wasn't betrayal. She said my mother needed to take responsibility for treating Jane like she didn't exist for an entire year, instead of getting mad at people for pointing it out. My mother had hung up on her, but my aunt didn't seem bothered. She said she was done protecting my mother's feelings when my mother had spent a year hurting Jane. Sunday came, and Daniel's parents invited us over for dinner. We drove to their house, and they had set up Jane's high chair at the table like they always did. After we ate, Daniel's mom brought out this beautiful photo album with Jane's name embossed on the cover. She opened it, and every single page was filled with pictures of Jane from her first year. There were photos from the hospital when she was born and pictures from every month as she grew. There were photos of Jane with Daniel's parents at the park and at their house and at our house during their weekly visits. They'd been documenting Jane's entire first year while my mother pretended she didn't exist. I started crying right there at the table because Jane would always have proof that she was loved and celebrated, even if one grandmother couldn't see her worth. Daniel's dad squeezed my shoulder and said they were honored to be part of Jane's life. The next week, I called a therapist named Naomi Silva, who my friend had recommended. I told her the whole story about my mother's rejection and the empty box and the party confrontation. Naomi listened without interrupting, and then she said something that made me start crying again. She said my mother's rejection said everything about my mother's problems, and nothing about Jane's value. She explained that some people can't get past their own prejudices even when it means hurting innocent children. She said I was grieving the mother I wished I had instead of accepting the mother I actually had. We talked about class prejudice and how my mother had tied Daniel's job to his worth as a person, and by extension, Jane's worth as my mother's grandchild. Naomi helped me understand that protecting Jane from that toxic thinking was the right choice even though it hurt. My father kept coming over every Thursday afternoon to spend time with Jane. During one visit, he told me quietly that my mother was angry he was choosing sides. He said he'd explained to her that he wasn't choosing sides, but rather choosing to have a relationship with his granddaughter. He told her that if having a relationship with Jane felt like betrayal, then she needed to ask herself why spending time with her own grandchild threatened her so much. My mother apparently didn't have an answer for that. My father looked tired and sad, but he also looked determined. He said he'd already missed too much of Jane's first year by not standing up to my mother sooner, and he wasn't going to miss any more. 4 weeks after the party, I got a long email from my mother. The subject line said we need to talk. I opened it and started reading. She wrote that she was sorry I felt hurt, but then spent 3 paragraphs defending everything she'd done. She claimed the empty box was about financial responsibility and teaching me to plan for Jane's future instead of wasting money on toys. She said her behavior had nothing to do with Daniel being a mechanic, and everything to do with wanting me to be smart with money. She wrote that she'd been helping my sister pay for the twins' preschool because my sister had asked for help and I never had. The email made my stomach hurt because it was so clearly fake. She wasn't actually sorry, and she wasn't taking any real responsibility for what she'd done. I showed the email to Naomi at our next session. She read it carefully and then explained that it was a non-apology. She said my mother was apologizing for my feelings instead of apologizing for her actions. Naomi helped me see that my mother was still trying to justify why her rejection was actually reasonable, instead of admitting it was cruel. We spent the session writing a response email together. I wrote that I needed acknowledgement of her year-long pattern of rejection, not justifications for why that rejection made sense. I explained that treating Jane like she was invisible wasn't about financial planning, and we both knew it. I told her that until she could honestly admit what she'd done and why she'd done it, we couldn't move forward. I sent the email and felt scared, but also relieved that I'd been clear about what I needed. My mother never responded to my email. A week later, my father told me that my mother had shown him my response and called me unreasonable and dramatic. He said he'd finally lost his patience with her. He told her that their daughter and granddaughter didn't need her permission to feel hurt by cruel behavior. He said my mother had spent a year punishing a baby for having the wrong father, and that no amount of justification would make that okay. My father said my mother had gone silent after that, and locked herself in their bedroom for hours. He didn't know if she was actually thinking about what she'd done, or just angry that people kept calling her out. Either way, he said he was proud of me for standing firm on what I needed, even though it was hard. 3 days after my father told me about my mother's version of events, my sister called me crying. I could hear her twins playing loudly in the background while she tried to talk through the tears. She said our mother had come over that morning and started comparing our parenting styles. My mother told her that she was a better mother than me because she'd married someone appropriate and was raising her children in a stable environment. My sister said she'd had enough at that point. She told our mother that Daniel was a wonderful father and husband who worked hard to provide for his family. She said job titles don't determine someone's worth as a person, and that our mother's obsession with status had damaged our entire family. My mother apparently left without saying another word. My sister apologized for not standing up to our mother sooner and said she was done enabling the prejudice. I thanked her and told her I understood how hard it was to confront our mother, because I'd spent years avoiding it myself. The next week, I started noticing a shift in how the family was treating the situation. My sister texted me daily to check on Jane and sent photos of the twins asking when they could have a play date with their cousin. My aunt called to say she'd told several relatives about the empty box incident, and that most of them were disgusted by my mother's behavior. My cousin posted a photo on social media of Jane from the party, with a caption about loving all her family members equally. My mother tried to rally support by calling various relatives and explaining her side of the story. She told them I was overreacting and keeping Jane from her grandparents over one misunderstanding. My aunt said most family members weren't buying it because they'd witnessed a year of rejection firsthand. They'd seen my mother ignore Jane at family gatherings. They'd noticed she never mentioned Jane when talking about her grandchildren. They'd watched her fuss over the twins while treating Jane like she was invisible. My cousin told me that our uncle had called my mother and said he was disappointed in her treatment of an innocent baby. Another relative sent my mother a long message about how damaging it was to punish a child for her father's occupation. My mother blocked several family members on social media after they commented on her posts asking why she'd given Jane an empty box. 6 weeks after the party, I was folding laundry in the living room while Jane napped upstairs. Daniel was at work and the house was quiet. I heard a car pull into the driveway and looked out the window. My mother was walking up to the front door carrying a gift bag. I felt my stomach drop because she hadn't called or texted to say she was coming. She knocked loudly, and I walked to the door but didn't open it. She knocked again and said she needed to see Jane. I told her through the door that surprise visits weren't acceptable. I explained that she needed to respect the boundaries I'd set for my family's well-being. She needed to call ahead and ask permission before coming over. She needed to understand that showing up unannounced wasn't going to work anymore. My mother's voice got louder through the door. She said I was being ridiculous and that grandmothers should be able to visit their grandchildren whenever they want. I reminded her that she'd spent a year acting like Jane didn't exist, so the grandmother card didn't work anymore. I told her that if she wanted to rebuild a relationship with Jane, it would happen on my terms, not hers. She needed to respect our family's boundaries and stop trying to force her way back in after a year of rejection. My mother started crying and saying I was cruel to keep a grandmother from her grandchild. She said she'd made mistakes, but that I was punishing her too harshly. I felt my hands shaking as I stood there listening to her cry. I told her through the door that she didn't get to act like Jane didn't exist for 12 months, and then show up demanding access. I reminded her of every time she'd changed the subject when I mentioned my pregnancy. Every time she'd refused to hold Jane or look at photos. Every family dinner where she'd kept Jane on the floor in a car seat. Every social media post about the twins with zero mention of Jane. I told her that one confrontation at a party didn't erase 12 months of deliberate rejection and cruelty. I heard footsteps on the porch, and then Daniel's truck pulled into the driveway. He'd come home early from the shop because I'd texted him that my mother was here. He walked up to the porch and stood next to my mother. He said her name quietly and she turned to look at him. He told her firmly, but not unkindly, that she wasn't welcome until she could genuinely acknowledge the pain she'd caused. He said Jane deserved better than a grandmother who showed up with gifts after a year of treating her like she was invisible. My mother's face changed and she turned her anger on Daniel. She called him an insecure mechanic who had turned her daughter against her. She said he'd poisoned me against my own family because he was embarrassed about his working-class job. Daniel looked at her for a long moment and then closed the door calmly without saying another word. I heard my mother yelling on the porch for another minute before her car door slammed and she drove away. Daniel came inside and sat down on the couch. He put his head in his hands and I sat next to him. He said her words hurt more than he expected. He'd known for years that my mother looked down on him for being a mechanic, but hearing her say it so directly made it real. He said it confirmed that her rejection of Jane had always been about her embarrassment over his job. She'd spent a year punishing an innocent baby because she was ashamed that her daughter had married someone who worked with his hands instead of sitting in an office. I put my arms around him and held him while he processed what had just happened. He said he'd never understood how someone could reject their own grandchild over something so meaningless as job status. I told him it wasn't about him or his worth. It was about my mother's need to feel superior and her obsession with appearances. He nodded, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. The next week, I had a session with Naomi and told her about my mother showing up and what she'd said to Daniel. Naomi listened carefully and then helped me work through the guilt I felt. I told her I felt responsible for Daniel experiencing this class-based cruelty from my family. Naomi reminded me that I didn't create my mother's prejudice. She said I'd chosen to marry Daniel knowing my mother disapproved, and that showed strength, not weakness. She explained that protecting Jane from toxic behavior was the right choice even when it was painful. She said children internalize how adults treat them, and that allowing my mother access without genuine change would teach Jane that she wasn't worthy of respect. Naomi helped me see that setting boundaries wasn't cruel. It was necessary for Jane's emotional well-being and for our family's health. 2 days later, my sister sent me a screenshot of my mother's social media. She'd posted a vague message about ungrateful children who don't appreciate everything their parents have done for them. She wrote about being punished for honesty, and how the truth hurts, but someone has to say it. My sister had commented asking her to stop the passive-aggressive posts and have a direct conversation with me instead. My mother deleted the comment within minutes. The next day, she posted another message about how modern parents are too sensitive and can't handle constructive criticism. My sister commented again, saying that giving a baby an empty box wasn't constructive criticism. My mother deleted that comment too and then blocked my sister. My sister called me laughing and crying at the same time. She said our mother was completely incapable of taking responsibility for her actions. 2 months after the party, my father came over for his weekly visit with Jane. He looked tired and frustrated. He told me that my mother had been talking to her friends about the situation. She'd been painting herself as the victim of my overreaction. She told them she'd given Jane a symbolic gift to teach me about financial planning, and I'd blown it completely out of proportion. She said I was keeping Jane from her because I was vindictive and couldn't forgive one small mistake. My father said he was frustrated because she genuinely seemed to believe her own version of events. She'd convinced herself that she'd done nothing wrong and that I was being unreasonable. He said every time he tried to talk to her about the year of rejection, she'd change the subject or act like he was attacking her. He didn't know how to get through to someone who refused to see their own behavior clearly. The following week, my aunt called and asked if my sister and I wanted to meet her for lunch without our mother. We met at a small restaurant halfway between our houses. My aunt ordered coffee and then looked at both of us seriously. She said she'd been watching our mother's narcissistic patterns for decades. She explained that our mother had always needed to control narratives and feel superior to other people. She would rewrite history in her mind until she was always the victim or the hero. She couldn't handle anyone challenging her version of events because it threatened her self-image. My aunt said my refusal to accept my mother's behavior was threatening everything she'd built. My mother had spent years positioning herself as the perfect mother and grandmother. Having family members publicly call out her cruelty toward Jane destroyed that image. My aunt said our mother would probably never take full responsibility because it would require admitting she was wrong. She said the best we could hope for was limited acknowledgement and changed behavior moving forward. I asked my aunt during that lunch why nobody said anything before the party. She put down her coffee cup and looked at me for a long moment. She admitted the family had let my mother get away with too much for years because nobody wanted the drama. Everyone saw what was happening, but they all stayed quiet hoping it would fix itself. She said watching my mother hand Jane that empty box finally made the price of keeping peace feel too expensive. My sister shifted in her seat and started talking about something that had been bothering her. She said she'd been thinking about all the times our mother praised her parenting over the past year. At first it felt nice, but now she was noticing these little digs mixed in with the compliments. Our mother would say things like how lucky she was that her twins had a stable home, or how grateful she should be that she married someone with a real career. My sister realized our mother had been using her kids as weapons against me this whole time. The favoritism toward the twins wasn't just about loving them more. It was about making me feel like I'd failed by marrying Daniel. My sister's voice cracked when she said she was sorry for not seeing it sooner. A few days after that lunch, my friend Peggy called. She'd been at the party and seen everything. She told me she couldn't stop thinking about the empty box and how my family finally stood up to my mother. Peggy said it made her look at her own family differently. She'd been watching her sister enable their fathers drinking for years, and nobody ever said anything because it was easier to pretend everything was fine. Seeing my aunt and cousin speak up made her realize that sometimes love means telling the truth even when it's uncomfortable. The weeks crawled by after that. Jane learned to clap her hands, and Daniel taught her to wave bye-bye. My father came every week to visit, and he'd sit on the floor playing with Jane for hours. He never mentioned my mother, and I didn't ask. Then 10 weeks after the party, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. She wanted to meet for coffee to move past this. I stared at the message for a while before responding. I told her I'd meet her, but Daniel was coming with me. She needed to understand that any conversation about our family included him, because he was Jane's father and my partner. She didn't reply right away, but eventually sent back a time and place. The coffee shop was one of those chain places with uncomfortable chairs and too bright lighting. Daniel and I got there first and sat at a corner table. My mother walked in exactly on time, carrying her purse like a shield. She saw Daniel and her face went tight. She asked why he was there before she even sat down. This was supposed to be a mother-daughter conversation. I told her that her rejection of Jane had everything to do with her feelings about Daniel, so he absolutely needed to be part of this. She sat down stiffly and ordered a black coffee when the server came by. The conversation felt like pulling teeth. My mother kept insisting she had nothing against Daniel personally, but that she'd had higher hopes for my life. Daniel leaned forward and asked her directly if she understood that ignoring Jane for a year had been cruel. My mother deflected immediately, saying she'd been waiting for things to settle down. I felt my hands clench under the table. I told my mother I needed to hear her say 3 specific things. First, that she deliberately ignored Jane for a year. Second, that her behavior came from being disappointed about Daniel's job. Third, that her actions hurt an innocent child who deserved her grandmother's love. My mother went completely silent. She stared at her coffee cup like it might give her answers. The silence stretched out so long that people at other tables started glancing over. After what felt like forever, my mother said quietly that she may have been too harsh. But then she added that she had valid concerns about financial stability. I explained that valid concerns didn't justify treating a baby like she didn't exist. Daniel provided well for our family through honest work, and we weren't struggling. Daniel spoke up then. He said he was proud of his work, and he was tired of being treated like he wasn't good enough because he worked with his hands instead of sitting in an office. My mother actually flinched, but she didn't apologize. Instead, she said she came from a different generation with different expectations. I told her that generational differences didn't excuse cruelty. Plenty of people from her generation managed to love their grandchildren no matter what their parents did for work. She looked genuinely uncomfortable for the first time. I watched her face as she processed what I'd said, and realized she was starting to understand that she couldn't justify her behavior away with excuses about being from a different time or having different values. She opened her mouth, and I watched her face work through what she wanted to say next. The silence stretched between us while Daniel sat perfectly still beside me. My mother finally spoke, and her voice came out smaller than usual. She said she was sorry I was hurt. I held up my hand immediately and stopped her before she could continue. I explained that I needed her to be sorry for what she did, not sorry that I had feelings about those things. She blinked at me like I'd spoken another language. I could see her trying to understand the difference and struggling with it. Her mouth opened and closed twice without any sound coming out. Daniel leaned forward slightly, and his presence reminded her that this wasn't just between me and her anymore. My mother's hands twisted around her coffee cup, and she stared down at the table. She admitted quietly that she handled things poorly with Jane. It wasn't the full acknowledgement I needed, but it was the first time she'd admitted any wrongdoing without immediately justifying it. I felt Daniel's hand find mine under the table and squeeze gently. The conversation ended without full resolution, but with something that felt like the beginning of real honesty. My mother stood up first and gathered her purse against her chest like a shield. She told us she needed time to think about everything we'd said. Daniel and I watched her walk out of the coffee shop and disappear into the parking lot. I sat in Naomi's office 2 days later and recounted the entire coffee shop conversation. She listened carefully and took notes while I talked. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. Naomi explained that people with narcissistic patterns rarely make complete transformations. She said my mother's partial acknowledgement was progress, but I needed to decide what level of relationship I could accept, given her limited capacity for genuine accountability. I asked if I was being unreasonable to want a full apology. Naomi shook her head and told me my expectations were completely valid, but that I might never get what I deserved from my mother. She encouraged me to focus on what I could control, which was my own boundaries and my daughter's well-being. I left the session feeling both validated and sad. The validation came from knowing my needs were reasonable. The sadness came from accepting that my mother might never be capable of meeting those needs. My father called 3 days after the coffee meeting. His voice sounded tired when I answered. He told me my mother came home shaken from our conversation and that she'd been quieter than usual since then. I asked him what that meant exactly. He explained that she wasn't making her usual dismissive comments or trying to control the narrative about what happened. He thought the confrontation with both me and Daniel together made the reality of her behavior harder to dismiss. But he added carefully that he wasn't sure if she was capable of the full apology I deserved. I thanked him for being honest and told him I appreciated his continued presence in Jane's life. He said he loved his granddaughter and that nothing would change that. After we hung up, I sat on the couch and stared at my phone. Daniel came in from the garage where he'd been working and asked if I was okay. I told him about the call and he sat down beside me. We didn't say much, but his presence was enough. 3 months passed after the birthday party. Jane learned to pull herself up on furniture and babble constantly. My father came every Tuesday to visit and play with her. Daniel's parents hosted us for dinner every Sunday. My mother remained absent except for occasional texts that said nothing meaningful. Then one afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from her. She asked if she could attend Jane's next pediatrician appointment to start being more involved. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I typed out that regular appointments weren't the place to begin rebuilding relationship. I explained that she could come to our house for a supervised visit if she was genuinely ready to engage with Jane. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Her response came back within minutes, agreeing to the supervised visit. The day of the visit arrived faster than I expected. Daniel stayed home from work and we spent the morning preparing. Jane played in her activity center while we cleaned the living room even though it was already clean. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 o'clock. My mother stood on the porch holding a wrapped package and looking uncomfortable. I opened the door and let her in without hugging her. She stepped inside and immediately spotted Jane across the room. My mother walked over slowly and placed the wrapped package on the coffee table. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal an age-appropriate toy instead of an empty box. Jane watched this stranger in her house with cautious eyes. My mother lowered herself awkwardly to the floor and held out the toy. Jane didn't move toward her. My mother's face showed hurt, but she didn't give up. She pressed a button on the toy and it made music. Jane's attention shifted to the sound. My mother pressed it again and Jane took one uncertain step closer. Daniel and I sat on the couch watching every interaction carefully. My mother attempted to engage Jane with the toy and her movements were stiff and uncertain. She clearly had no idea how to play with a toddler. Jane reached for the toy and my mother handed it to her. Their fingers touched briefly and my mother's eyes got wet. Jane took the toy and moved back toward her activity center away from the stranger. My mother stayed on the floor looking lost. Jane remained cautious throughout the hour-long visit. She would glance at my mother occasionally but wouldn't approach her directly. My mother tried several times to initiate play, but Jane treated her like any unfamiliar person. I watched my mother's face as the reality of being a stranger to her own granddaughter sank in. Her hurt was visible in the way her shoulders dropped and how she stopped trying quite as hard. When the hour ended, my mother stood up slowly from the floor. She told us quietly that she would like to try again if we'd let her. I explained gently that Jane didn't know her because she wasn't present for the first year. I added that rebuilding relationship would take consistent effort over time. My mother nodded and gathered her purse. She left without the dramatic exit I'd seen so many times before. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a text from her. She wrote that the visit was harder than expected, but that she wanted to try again. I appreciated the honesty in those words. I texted back agreeing to another visit in 2 weeks and made clear that consistency and genuine engagement were required moving forward. My sister called the next evening while I was giving Jane a bath. She said our mother had been asking her questions about child development and appropriate ways to interact with toddlers. My sister thought our mother was genuinely trying to figure out how to be present for Jane, even if her pride made full apology difficult. I asked my sister what kinds of questions. She listed off things like what toys were appropriate for Jane's age and how to get a toddler to warm up to you. I felt something shift inside me hearing that my mother was actually trying to learn. It didn't erase the past year, but it suggested she might be capable of change even if that change came slowly. 2 days later, my neighbor Kay stopped by with cookies. We sat at my kitchen table while Jane napped upstairs. Kay told me she'd been thinking about my situation since I'd mentioned it weeks ago. She shared that her own mother-in-law had rejected her first child because of family drama. Kay explained that her mother-in-law eventually came around, but that the relationship never fully recovered. She said the years of rejection left scars that couldn't be completely healed even with later effort. Kay looked at me seriously and told me that protecting my child's emotional well-being was always the right choice even when it was hard. She said some grandparents never learn and some learn too late. The important thing was that Jane would grow up knowing I fought for her worth. I thanked Kay for sharing her experience and felt less alone knowing someone else had walked a similar path. The next week, my mother arrived exactly on time for her visit. She brought a puzzle with big wooden pieces designed for toddlers and sat on the floor without being asked. Jane watched her from across the room while playing with blocks. My mother held up a puzzle piece and smiled at Jane. Jane didn't move closer, but she didn't turn away either. My mother started putting pieces into the puzzle by herself, and Jane's curiosity eventually pulled her over. She grabbed a piece and tried to force it into the wrong spot. My mother gently showed her how to match the shapes, and Jane let her help. Their hands touched briefly as they worked together, and my mother's eyes got wet. The visit lasted an hour, and my mother asked when she could come back. I told her the same time next week, and she nodded. She started showing up every Tuesday afternoon. Jane slowly warmed to her, but still ran to Daniel's mother whenever she visited on other days. I watched my mother notice this preference and work harder to earn Jane's attention. She learned which toys Jane liked and which songs made her dance. She stopped checking her phone during visits and focused completely on Jane. The progress was slow, but it was real. 4 months after the party, my mother asked if she could take Jane to the park alone. I was folding laundry when she brought it up and I stopped mid-fold. I told her we weren't ready for that yet. She looked disappointed, but she didn't argue or storm out. She just asked what she needed to do to earn that trust. I explained that consistency mattered more than grand gestures, and that Jane needed more time with her before unsupervised visits made sense. My mother accepted this and changed the subject to Jane's new words. The conversation felt strange because it was calm. No drama or tears or accusations. Just a boundary stated and respected. My father stopped by the next afternoon while my mother was at her book club. He sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee and thanked me for giving my mother another chance. He said he was proud of how I'd handled everything with clear boundaries but room for growth. He admitted he was seeing his wife confront her own prejudices for the first time in their marriage. She'd asked him recently if he thought Daniel was a good father, and my father had told her Daniel was an excellent father. My mother had gone quiet after that. My father squeezed my hand across the table and said he should have stood up sooner. I told him I was glad he was standing up now. I had a session with Naomi later that week, and we talked about what realistic reconciliation looked like. She explained that people with narcissistic traits rarely make complete transformations. They might improve their behavior, but the core patterns often remained. She helped me understand that my mother might never become the grandmother I'd hoped for when I was pregnant. But supervised visits where my mother showed respect were better than complete separation, if Jane could have some relationship with her. Naomi asked what I needed to feel safe moving forward. I told her I needed my mother to maintain consistent effort and never make Jane feel less than because of who her father was. Naomi wrote that down, and we worked on scripts for addressing future boundary violations. The following Tuesday, my mother arrived with a stuffed bunny for Jane. They played together on the living room floor, and my mother commented that she hoped Jane would marry well someday. The words hit me like cold water. I stopped Jane's toy mid-roll and looked at my mother directly. I told her I wanted Jane to marry someone who treated her with respect and love regardless of their job. I explained that Daniel treated me better than any lawyer or doctor could have, and that Jane deserved that same kind of partnership. My mother went quiet. She picked at the carpet and didn't argue back. She just nodded slowly and asked Jane if she wanted to read a book. The moment passed without explosion, but I'd made my point clear. 5 months after the party, Daniel's parents invited everyone to a barbecue at their house. They called my parents directly and included them in the invitation. The day arrived warm and sunny. My mother showed up in a nice dress looking uncomfortable. She was polite to Daniel's mother but kept her distance. She thanked Daniel's father for having her and he smiled warmly back. I watched her watch Daniel's parents interact with Jane. They picked her up easily and made her laugh. They knew her favorite foods and which games she liked. My mother stood apart holding a paper plate and I realized she was ashamed. She was face to face with the grandparents who'd shown up every week while she'd stayed away. The contrast was visible in every interaction. Tristan walked over to my mother with a burger and asked if she wanted cheese on it. He made small talk about the weather and thanked her for coming. His warmth was genuine despite everything she'd done to his son. He treated her with grace she hadn't earned, and I saw her process that reality. Daniel came from good people who'd raised him with strong values. My mother had spent a year acting like his family wasn't good enough when they'd been the ones showing up with love and consistency. Tristan asked my mother about her garden and she answered quietly. He listened like her answers mattered and offered tips for her rose bushes. The conversation was ordinary, but the kindness behind it highlighted her year of cruelty. Later, my mother pulled me aside near the fence. She said quietly that she was beginning to understand what she'd missed during Jane's first year. Her voice had a different quality than usual, less defensive and more sad. She didn't say sorry exactly, but the regret was real in how she looked at me. I told her I appreciated her saying that. It wasn't the full apology I deserved, but it was honest emotion I hadn't heard from her before. She asked if she could help clean up after the barbecue, and I said yes. We carried plates inside together in silence. That night, Daniel and I talked in bed after Jane was asleep. We discussed what level of relationship made sense with my mother moving forward. We agreed supervised visits could continue, and that we'd slowly increase her access if she maintained respectful behavior. But we wouldn't pretend the past year hadn't happened. We wouldn't accept future cruelty or comments about Daniel's job. Jane would grow up knowing her worth wasn't tied to status or money. Daniel held my hand in the dark and said he was grateful Jane had me as her mother. I told him she was lucky to have him as her father. My sister called 2 days later while I was grocery shopping. She said our mother had been talking more openly about their grandmother lately. Our mother had mentioned how obsessed her own mother was with social status and keeping up appearances. She'd shared stories about being taught to value what people thought over what actually mattered. My sister thought our mother was starting to connect those childhood wounds to how she'd treated Daniel and Jane. She wasn't making excuses, but she was finally looking at where her prejudice came from. My sister said it didn't fix anything, but maybe it meant real change was possible. I pushed my cart past the cereal aisle and told my sister I hoped she was right. 6 months after the party, my mother was sitting on our living room floor during one of her weekly visits when Jane pulled herself up on the coffee table. She stood there wobbling and looking at Daniel's parents, who were also visiting. Then Jane let go and took 3 shaky steps toward Tristan before falling into his arms. My mother's hand flew to her mouth and tears started running down her face. She pulled out her phone with shaking fingers and called my father right there in front of everyone. Her voice cracked as she told him what just happened, and I heard real joy in her tone for the first time when talking about Jane. After she hung up, she looked at me with wet cheeks and said she was sorry she'd missed so much of Jane's first year. The emotion felt genuine instead of performative, and I nodded because I didn't trust my voice. 2 weeks later, my mother called and asked if she could host a small family dinner for Jane's half-birthday. I hesitated, but Daniel squeezed my hand and I agreed cautiously. When we arrived at my parents' house, I noticed immediately that she'd put framed photos of Jane on the mantel next to the pictures of my sister's twins. The dining room had a high chair set up, and my mother had made Jane's favorite foods that she'd clearly asked Daniel's mother about. My father kept smiling at my mother like he was proud of her effort, and I realized this was the grandmother I'd hoped for 18 months ago, finally showing up. During dinner, my mother stood up with her wine glass and the room went quiet. She thanked everyone for their patience with her and said she'd made serious mistakes during Jane's first year that she was working hard to correct. She didn't make excuses or blame anyone else, and my father's shoulders relaxed like he'd been holding tension for months. My sister reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. After dinner, I watched Jane playing on the floor, surrounded by people who loved her. Daniel's parents were building blocks with her while my father made silly faces. My sister sat nearby with her twins, and my aunt and cousin were laughing at something Jane did. Even my mother was down on the floor trying to engage instead of keeping her distance. She'd never be the perfect grandmother I'd imagined, but Jane was growing up knowing she mattered to the people around her. Our family had survived something that could have broken us, and we'd come out stronger because I'd refused to accept cruelty as normal. Daniel put his arm around me and kissed my temple, and I felt grateful for the life we'd built together despite my mother's initial rejection.